welcome to another Sagely Health webinar. My name is Jeremy. I'm the CTO of Sagely Health. I am joined, as always, with Dr. Jason Sager, CEO and founder of Sagely Health. Hello, Jason.
Hello. Hi, everyone.
So we'll get right into it. The topic for today's webinar is how your oncologist chooses treatments. And another way to kind of understand this, if you are a patient, is how do you evaluate the treatments your oncologist is offering you? So, Jason, I'll jump right into it. Could you let me know how does an oncologist, when you end up in their office, how do they make a choice on which treatments to provide a given patient?
Yeah. And again, it's such a chaotic situation for patients to be diagnosed with cancer. Oftentimes, it's really hard to understand that there's a choice in an oncologist. Frequently, they're getting diagnosed either by their primary care doctor or maybe a surgeon who's done a biopsy and says, you have cancer. Why don't you go either down the hallway or down the street and meet this oncologist? And they're referred to an oncologist. So some patients may say, well, I know great cancer centers and I want to go to a place like Memorial Sloan Kettering or Mayo Clinic or MD Anderson. Those are all great centers. So at the end of the day, does any of that matter? And how does a patient, how is a doctor selecting this treatment? I think patients assume that the doctor is selecting the treatment based on their expertise. That if let's say they're diagnosed with breast cancer, then they are expert in all things breast cancer. And so they know all the literature, they know everything that's going on in breast cancer, and they're selecting specifically for that patient what the treatment should be. Unfortunately, that is the way one hopes that it works. However, it's really not the way that it works today in terms of at least those first steps in standard of care. And I think there's a really important distinction is that there is standard of care, which all hospitals in the United States practice. Anyone who has an oncologist who offers it will offer the same standard of care that you would get in any other hospital, really regardless of whether it's Mayo Clinic or a small oncologist cancer center in Idaho, for example. And so then how does this get selected? Well, there is a consortium, there's a group of MDs, of physicians, and oncologists who get together about twice, sometimes 3 times a year, and they discuss what should the standard of care be. They then create a document that has this, and that group is called the NCCN, which is the National Comprehensive Cancer Network. And again, they have a group of physicians that does it for breast cancer, a different one for colon cancer, different one for sarcoma. Every cancer type, or at least the top 50 or so, they have different groups getting together and providing these opinions 2 or 3 times a year. And this all gets boiled out into the recommendations, the NCCN recommendations, which are published. And here I can share my screen and show you an example of one of these recommendations. And this was published in a publication article recently. And this is the one on breast cancer. And so this, I think, is the first version for actually it's the third version for 2024. And so if you look at this and you're an expert doctor, an oncologist, but really any oncologist can look at this and understand, okay, well, I have a patient here who has hormone receptor positive, that's estrogen receptor or progesterone receptor, HER2 negative disease, and their tumor is of a certain size and their lymph nodes is of certain status, and they have ductal or lobular carcinoma or maybe some of these others. And you go along and you basically say, well, if there's a lot of lymph nodes that are positive, and what's going on in the adjuvant treatment, and the answer is you get adjuvant chemotherapy followed by endocrine therapy. Okay, if it's a very small tumor and the lymph nodes are negative, you're considering adjuvant endocrine therapy, but there's no chemotherapy there. Sometimes it gets more complex. And folks that have breast cancer and may have heard about the Oncotype DX test, say 21 gene assay test that basically determines based on age and other factors, what's this recurrence score. And based on the recurrence score, you could see what the instructions are to physicians. And so really, by being a trained oncologist, you're basically reading this and understanding what you have to do. In terms of what is adjuvant endocrine therapy, they don't tell you here. They do in the sort of in the fine points of which medicines to give. For example, here's a CDK4/6 inhibitor called abemaciclib. But you can see this is complex. This is not written in a way that patients can really understand. And so even though it's publicly accessible, it's really quite complicated and difficult to look at and know, okay, well, is the oncologist that I'm seeing giving me the standard of care or not? And this is something that we help patients to understand when they come to us.
So from looking at this, it sounds like your doctor is going to understand if it's breast cancer or it's pancreatic cancer. There's a series of diagnostic tests that should be run to kind of give you some of these details, everything from having a scan to having a biopsy to maybe having some blood tests, maybe having some tumor sequencing done and these sorts of things. So these are kind of giving them the data, not just that they need these, they should perform these tests, but kind of what to do with the results, right?
That's right. That's right.
So all the treatments that are, when we say standard, I just kind of want to describe what that means. So all the treatments in here are considered standard treatments. They might be recommended in different scenarios, as you're kind of pointing in this flow chart.
Right.
But what makes an intervention a standard treatment? I mean,
yeah. And if we look, actually, NCCN produces a patient guide, and we can look at this guide, and the standards are right here. These are chemotherapy examples, targeted therapy examples. Here's that drug that I was just referencing in the other paper. And again, this is publicly accessible. But what this lacks is sort of the instructions for when to use what, right? And so that's going to the oncologist. But all of these have been blessed as standard or accepted as standard. And the reason is because they've been shown in clinical trials to really be able to do better than the prior standard. And so they've replaced the prior standard, or maybe they moved up in lines of therapy so that patients are getting it when they're newly diagnosed, as opposed to having to get certain medicines first before they get the medicine as a third or fourth line treatment. And so at the end of the day, all of these have been shown, and you have breast cancer, there are a lot of options. But again, it doesn't really give, this particular summary doesn't give you the instructions of, well, when would I use a medicine like a PI3 kinase inhibitor? Well, we talked about, or a PARP inhibitor. We talked about that tumor sequencing, right? And the diagnostics. And I know what the flow chart says. There's a different flow chart that says, yes, if you've done the sequencing and it shows a BRCA mutation, then you're using olaparib. If you've done the sequencing and it shows a PI3 kinase mutation, you're using one of these medicines. And so those are the sorts of instructions that are contained in the other sort of diagram type article. But yes, these are all standard and available to every oncologist who is who practices medicine in the U.S. And those are basically, there's another way that they become standards, which is the FDA is approving of these as standard. So there's the FDA, they approve them as standard. There's the NCCN who recommends them, and how they're used. And so the two of them together sort of formulate the standards of care for cancer.
So that makes sense. So a clinical trial is run, and the data from that trial is given to the FDA to say, hey, we think this drug could be approved because it's performing better than the existing standard. The FDA, if they agree with that, approves the drug. The NCCN that produces these guidelines then kind of has that as a tool in their belt, and they can say, okay, well, that's where this factors in. It should be used in this case. Like you said, if you had that PICA3CA mutation, therefore this is the drug because the mechanism of action of that drug targets that, or, so you kind of have it. So and then you said that all of these are produced for various types of cancer. So we're looking at a breast cancer example, but there's across all the different types, there's different guides produced
Yep.
and reviewed regularly. So does that mean that, I mean, is every oncologist pulling up this guide when they're meeting with a patient?
Yes. I mean, they may know the guide or the latest changes in the guide from prior patients if they see, let's say, a lot of breast cancer patients. But yes, at the end of the day, they're going through each of these. And oftentimes I'm asked, sort of like, how can you know what the standard of care is for breast cancer and then turn around and do the same thing for a patient with colon cancer? The answer is, well, I just get out the NCCN guide and it tells me what the answer is for each of those patients.
I want to get to kind of the ramifications of second opinions based on understanding that in a second. But I just want to take a little detour for a second in the sense that if you were a patient and you ended up in an oncologist's office and they told you they were going to treat you with one of the drugs that you're showing on the screen here, are there ways that a patient, obviously they can ask their doctor and their doctor may or may not have time to kind of go into detail, but are there ways the patient can kind of understand data about that drug, kind of how well it works, what the side effects might be? I mean, because I don't think patients are having a huge voice in which drugs they get, but they may want to have information about them in some way.
Well, and again, I mean, sometimes it's important. For example, the side effects for abemaciclib are very different from palbociclib and are different from ribociclib. And so if you are particularly sensitive to diarrhea, then you're not going to want abemaciclib. On the other hand, palbociclib has worse of the neutropenia and your lower white blood cell count. And so so becoming proactive in learning about these things is something that patients and their benefactors are doing every day. And they're Googling this stuff. And that's okay. What we've done is we pull this together in a way that tries to synthesize it for us so that we can guide patients and tell them not only what the recommendations are, but why. And so if you bear with me for a second here, I'm going to see if I can share this with you. So when we look into the standards of care, we have in our system all of those same standards. We've done it a little bit differently. So what we do is tell the computer what the patient has. Let's say they have stage 3B breast cancer. It's not a favorable histology. We can put in the diagnostics about whether they're HER2 positive, ER positive, PR positive. There are others as well, and then answer a bunch of questions. At the end of it, it pops up with the answers, and usually they're more focused than what you might see previously in that long list of treatments from NCCN. But in addition to that, what you can see here in the screen I'm showing you is that here's that option that we saw before, that abemaciclib. It is combined with fulvestrant, which previously was not part of the rubric. But if you looked at that diagram from NCCN, you would see it there. But what's really interesting is what we've done is to take a look and integrate the literature with that. And so you can see that there is there is an article. We can take a look at that article. If I click on this link, you'll get to the actual source. But what we have is a summary of that, and it says exactly why it works so well. It says that the median PFS, which is the progression-free survival, or how long the cancer is controlled, is about 2 years. And that is better than 21 months, which is closer to a year and a half that was compared to. And so that's how it comes to be recommended. But as mentioned before, diarrhea is a frequent event. Now it's controllable, and not that many patients left the trial because of it, and so it still gets us a rating of 4 stars out of 5. But it's something that we can instantaneously know and talk to the patient about. And so this is the type of way that we look at these in order to do better for our patients. And again, we have a list of them, and you can see the data compared to each other, and then we can guide and patients in that manner.
So let's talk a little bit about getting a second opinion, because this would make me think that I'm not sure that it's worth getting a second opinion if I'm going to go to another oncologist who has literally the exact same guidelines and the same information. And I think, like, I'm just curious if um, if there's a lot of flexibility in how oncologists use these guidelines. Would I expect to get something different, or would I just be kind of told, here's the same recommendation from a second opinion that I get?
Yeah. And that's where we get into talking about clinical trials, because so far we haven't mentioned clinical trials at all, and yet they exist. So, at what point does a doctor consider a clinical trial versus the standard of care? And unfortunately, most will not, or at least not originally, right? And the fact is that that a random oncologist or an oncologist that the patient's referred to because they're down the street or down the hallway, or even at Mayo Clinic or MD Anderson or Memorial Sloan Kettering, the chance that they're going to have a trial that matches that patient, even though there's like 13,000 trials out there, the chance that that doctor is going to have that trial that's going to match that patient is quite rare. It's about 3% or so of the time. 97% they don't, which means that if you ask for a second opinion and you're sent to a different oncologist who also doesn't have a clinical trial to offer that patient, then you're going to hear the same response. It's nearly guaranteed. And that's because everyone's following the NCCN guidelines, as they should. But what the NCCN says is, please consider a clinical trial at every step. And that's the one thing that is just not happening in the system enough. And so from our perspective, there may have been a handful of treatments before to consider, but when we look at clinical trials and we have them all in our system, and with the push of a button, we can include those as well, you can see the results. And I'll share my screen here and show you that, there's not 7 options anymore to be considered. There's actually 22. And again, we can start to look through, what the ratings are on these options. And then we can help the patient to understand which ones should they look at, which ones are closest to them, which one. And if you're going to see another doctor for a second opinion, make sure you see one who's got a clinical trial that's really prepared for you. And that way you have a chance. If that doctor says, no, 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 do the standard of care, well, then they know, because they know what the clinical trial is offering, and they can compare the results of the trial, even if it's in their head, with the standard of care. On the other hand, many patients, knowing that clinical trials are really the window to the future and future opportunity, many patients will end up on a clinical trial at every stage in their diagnosis, depending upon going to the doctor who's got one for them. And so that's where we tend to do better with recommendations for second opinions, is because we're choosing doctors who have those clinical trials.
Yeah, I just want to underline that there's often this kind of feeling that there's standard treatments and there's clinical trials, which are over here and somehow different. But the fact is, it's all part of the process. Every single recommended treatment in the guidelines once ran through a clinical trial, and through that clinical trial proved to be a better treatment than whatever was currently being used, and therefore was elevated and put into the guidelines to get there. So the goal of every single clinical trial that's going on is to improve upon the existing standards. So, like, in many trials, I think one of the reasons that NCCN could easily recommend a trial for any patient is, in most trials, if you have a comparison trial, I mean, they're actually doing the comparison, you're either going to get the standard therapy or something that a lot of very smart people believe is going to work better than the current standard. So there's kind of, and it's not just for later. It's not just this kind of experimental, like a last ditch effort, which I think a lot of people kind of understood clinical trials for a really long time. We see patients who are jumping into clinical trials, even in early diagnosis, just because they just see the data that shows that there's a better chance of a better outcome with the trial. And it's kind of worth looking at.
Absolutely. And so, from my perspective, I think it's something that, really is, again, can't emphasize it enough, that, as patients get diagnosed with cancer, it's a really chaotic situation. But finding doctors who have clinical trials at every step along the way for them is a really important thing to do. It's probably the most important thing, because those doctors will also be the ones who get the tumor sequencing, the genetic analysis. Those are the same thing. And they're the ones who get the advanced diagnostics that are needed, the scans. Again, everyone's going to get a biopsy, everyone's going to get a scan, but really integrating that together in a way that understands which trial options are the best. And if there are no trial options, or they're really far away and not worth the travel, it's okay to get the standard of care. But at least you know what's on the plate and what's a possibility and how those are looking. And so to me, that's the way we operate.
Could you, I know we've revisited this in other webinars, but when you say that about clinical trials, could you talk a little bit about low risk versus high risk, and how someone might kind of understand the risk level and how important trials could be if they're high risk?
Absolutely. And so, the to me, that it's an important distinction, because it does give a sense of when you expect the standard of care to work or not work. Now, again, there still could be clinical trials for both, but in low risk cancer, we expect that the standard of care will lead to a cure. And that cure should be either 80% or higher percent chance of time. So almost 8 out of 10 patients are going to be cured. Some patients would want even more. Some patients are okay with settling for a bit less. And so, but that's where we draw the line in understanding. If there's an 8 out of 10 chance in getting cured, go with the standard of care. Matter of fact, really adhere to it, because that has been proven on that basis. And so getting it exactly as it was given in the clinical trial at the time that it was run is going to lead to the same results. And so we get excited about situations which we call low risk cancer. Unfortunately, it's the minority of patients who have low risk cancer. Most patients have, and about 60 to 70% or so have high risk cancer, which is something about the cancer that makes it more aggressive, something where it's not as definitive that the cure can be obtained. Could be a borderline situation where the tumor is a bit too large to know that there's going to be a good margin with surgery. It could be that it's spread already and is either in the multiple lymph nodes, or even spread beyond, is in the liver, the lungs, or in other organs. And in all of those situations, which again comprise, unfortunately, the majority of patients with cancer today, those are high risk situations. And for them, finding the answer in terms of a clinical trial is going to be a potential avenue by which they can do better.
So there are kind of three areas I was thinking about in the sense of doing better, especially for high risk patients, though it could be for low risk as well. Is more advanced diagnostics than kind of what the standards out there. There's kind of the idea that you have a doctor who has clinical trials to offer. Maybe they don't put you on the clinical trial, but at least they're evaluating whether or not you should participate in the clinical trial as a better outcome, having a possible better outcome for you. And then there's also the idea of accessible therapies, which I kind of understand as kind of off-label therapies, meaning that it's approved. It can be used in cancer, but it might be against the guidelines in some way. But that might be a doctor who has some insight or experience that would lead them to be willing to pursue something that's not exactly in the guidelines. And it sounds like the doctors who are going to kind of look at those things are probably at NCI accredited cancer centers, like academic cancer centers. Is that kind of a correct way to understand that?
Yeah. And again, from my perspective, a lot of the NCI accredited cancer centers will have clinical trials and be running them. The very best way to do it is to actually, use our system, or have us use our system to find a specific match. That being said, if that's unavailable, certainly going to an NCI accredited cancer center is going to guarantee, number one, if you have a low risk cancer, you will have a place that's really super experienced, where they're doing the surgery multiple times a week, even.
Yeah.
And that's what you want. On the other hand, if you have a high risk, they have a better chance of having a clinical trial, or at least when you ask them about advanced diagnostics, tumor sequencing, etc. You ask them about clinical trials, they'll at least acknowledge and say, yes, we may have one for you, we may not, but at least they're not going to say, oh, that, that's for later. That's not something. More times they'll say that. Sometimes we still hear it. But in any case, to me, again, it's a better way of doing it. So if a patient has an option and they don't have access to us, then going to an NCI accredited cancer center is definitely the recommendation whenever possible.
Yeah. That makes sense. I mean, I just relate. Some of our patients have expressed this phrase I've heard a number of times where we've looked at the details, we've done a search across the country and found a doctor we believe they should see because of their involvement in clinical trials that exactly match the patient. And the patient makes an appointment, they go see this doctor for a second opinion, and the doctor looks at them and goes, "How did you find me?" Because they're kind of a needle in the haystack. They're out there, they're running their trial. They don't have access to the hundreds of thousands of cancer patients to choose from. They're kind of taking who comes in the door. And when we find these moments, whether it's them focusing on a certain genetic mutation or a surgical procedure or a combination of adjuvant therapy and something, but there are these doctors out there who are probably way more specialized in your situation, but it's very hard to find them. And one of the ways that we do it is by using the clinical trial data, what's going on, looking at the references that come out of it, and just finding these doctors because of their involvement. And this is not something like clinicaltrials.gov is not going to offer up this information to you. It's just not searchable in that way. It's not digestible in that way. It's not organized well. And so that's why we've created a system, just to be really clear, to kind of help kind of triage the patient to exactly the place they should be.
And some of these things are really cool. I brought one up on the screen here, which is showing a monitoring, right? So this is the same standard of care, but they are using advanced monitoring. And so here we're looking at circulating tumor DNA, which is little bits of DNA that are floating from the tumor in the blood. Now, these are not dangerous, but we can actually harvest them and use them to see how much tumor remains. And so they're guiding the use of the chemotherapy in such a way that they're utilizing this test to know, okay, well, there's none left. Okay, we can stop now. We expect that will lead to a cure. On the other hand, if we still see it increasing, then maybe the chemotherapy needs to be switched and changed to something else. And so there's lots and lots of trials going on. And again, they're all trying to do better, and many of them are succeeding. And so from my perspective, why not take a look at what's going on? Why not see sort of what's out there? And then you can choose. Obviously, if this was 3,000 miles away from your house, it may not be worth going there. But you can certainly, and what we do is often arm patients to bring it back to their doctor and say, hey, there's this trial going on over 3,000 miles away at MD Anderson, and I'm here in New Hampshire. Could we do the circulating tumor DNA here? And the answer is yes, they could. And we may even patch them through to speak to the doctor who's doing it at MD Anderson, for example, so that they can learn how it's being done and they can do similar things. And so this is a way where I think everyone can do better. And so that's why we kind of exist.
Yeah. I want to ask about payment and insurance coverage real quick, because we do get questions about this. So the idea is that I'm going to go to my oncologist, and if they recommend something from the NCCN guidelines, it's very likely that'll be covered by insurance, just because that's part of the process if you're following the guidelines, but it's not always guaranteed, right? And then there's also the idea of clinical trials where they'll try and bill your insurance for anything they can get from your insurance, but the sponsor of the trial generally is covering any other costs. I mean, you might have travel costs to go participate, but I just want to say, and then there will be challenges with some of the accessible therapies. If you want to access something that's not pointed out in the guidelines, the insurance may or may not cover it, and you probably have to petition the insurance company to do it, and they may turn it down. Is that a good way to understand it, or anything else you'd add to kind of that?
Yeah, I mean, again, for reasons that are quite beyond me, it's extraordinarily complex. And this is where I'm not sure it has to be, but this is the way the system has created it. So we talked about the FDA, and they sort of approved individual drugs to be used or combinations to be used in specific cancer types and specific lines of therapy. We talked about the NCCN, who gives guidance. It says, okay, well, we would use these drugs in this way. Here's more. You do the diagnostic and make your choices, your selections here, consider this, consider that. Okay. There's a third group, which we haven't talked about yet, called CMS, and they're the ones who actually authorize the payment by Medicare for the treatment. And generally, whatever they authorize for Medicare is also adopted by the private insurance companies. And so there's a whole system, and sometimes there can be disjointed parts where the FDA says it's yes, it's official, and the NCCN says we recommend it, but CMS says we're not paying for it. And so, fortunately, it's pretty small that we see that. Where it gets more is when it comes to things that are not necessarily within the bucket. So here, for example, is a situation where a sarcoma patient has a CDK4 amplification on a genetic analysis tumor sequencing test. And it's a perfectly legitimate test with a perfectly legitimate result. And there's a drug, that abemaciclib that we talked about is a CDK4/6 inhibitor. So it would be great to use for that patient. And their doctor may actually identify it. So, but there's two issues. One is that was the breast cancer, NCCN guidance. When it comes to sarcoma, they're not writing specifically about each of these gene mutations. And so they may not have captured that one. They may not mention it. It still makes sense to use it scientifically, but it's not in the NCCN as a specificity. Plus, it hasn't been approved specifically by the FDA. It's been approved in breast cancer, not in sarcoma. And so now the CMS says, yeah, we're not going to pay for that. And or the health insurance says, we're not going to pay for that. Again, here's a perfectly good idea, but it ends up not getting paid for by the insurance company. And that can really hurt patients tremendously and limit doctors' choices. So this is something that I think the system needs to work through. And the best is to actually appeal and say to the insurance company, hey, my doctor said that this is good. And the reason is because, I've got this genetic mutation and alteration with amplification of CDK4/6. And this drug is made against that. So you should give it to me. We actually write those letters for doctors to send into the health insurance company. And sometimes we win them. And so it's always good to give that a shot, but it is a place where it gets more difficult.
Yeah, there's a lot to navigate with this. So I think, we've covered it pretty well, but I just want to talk a little bit about kind of working with your oncologist and any kind of a guidance that we can give. Because, we've talked about this idea that, maybe your primary care doctor ordered a biopsy, it came back and they sent you to an oncologist. And so you've got an oncologist, you're sitting in their office, you're probably painfully aware of how busy they seem. They were probably late coming into your meeting. They seem like they're just looking at your details as they're walking in the door. I mean, and then, not oncologists, unfortunately, are equal in the sense of how up to date they're keeping. If did they get the guidelines that came out last week versus the ones from last year? Are they updating? Are they doing diagnostics and stuff? So, and then I'm sure that some oncologists have personal preferences and sort of things. So I just want to kind of ask you, and it's a little bit of summary of what we talked about, like what should a patient do in that situation? They find themselves with an oncologist. The oncologist seems like they're giving them an option, maybe just one. And kind of how do they evaluate that? And what should they be doing kind of in their head? And then what action should they be taking?
Absolutely. And so, so in summary, when diagnosed with cancer, understanding that it's chaotic and it's really overwhelming, the best thing is to find out, first of all, low risk versus high risk, right? And Google it, right? Google, what's my chance? What's my prognosis? That's a fancy word for it. With whatever it is that they have, breast cancer, stage 3C. Okay, go, and it'll tell you what the prognosis is. And again, if the cure is not 80% or more, then it's high risk. Right? High risk means start looking at clinical trials. Right? Now, step 2 is go into the oncologist's office. Whenever possible, choose an oncologist at an NCI accredited cancer center. That's where you're going to do your best. And you're not just getting an oncologist or one doctor. You're going to get a team. That team will have usually a surgical oncologist, especially if surgery is an option. They'll have a medical oncologist who can give the chemotherapy before the surgery, after the surgery, or directly in cases of metastatic disease. And then you have a radiation oncologist who uses radiation as a way of treating cancer and making sure that anything that is seen can be treated. And so those are three doctors, and they're at every NCI accredited cancer center, and they'll get together as part of a tumor board. And so it's really helpful to ask for that. And then basically do the homework and have friends, enlist in friends. If there's anyone in the family who's a skilled person, medical person, they can help with this and see what the options are. Approach the NCCN guides. If you can have someone who is understanding of them, that would be best. And I know it's really hard, but it is the best way to see this through and to make sure you are being offered the standard of care, or you're all being offered the best clinical trial that's available. And finally, that's why we're here. Come to us. We're here to help guide and find out what's the best for patients to get every step of the way. And we can let patients know when their doctor is doing exactly the best thing. Low risk cancer, standard of care, picked from the NCCN guide. We have the evidence to show there's a greater than 80% chance of cure here. Go forward, do what they're saying to do. And if not, we know exactly what the tests are that should be run. We know what the treatments are that are out there. We can find the very best for each and every patient with cancer. And so that's what we do.
Yeah, just to be clear, so we offer a consultation, and part of that consultation is getting your medical records, understanding your full situation, assessing that risk that you're talking about. Is this high risk, meaning that you probably should be considering clinical trials right away, or is it low risk, meaning that the current standard offers a good chance of a full cure? And then also looking at that and say, well, even if you're low risk, is there any way to do better? Is there anything out there that could improve your chances even more? If you're high risk, then you're kind of navigating the clinical trial system, and we can help you find those needles in the haystack of where you should go and who you should see and what you should talk to them about and see what's out there, because it's too much for anybody to manage. I mean, I've just seen that on my own. I mean, people try. I think getting to an NCI accredited cancer center is the best thing for you, but Sagely Health is really here to help you kind of even within that realm of pinpoint even more closely where you should maybe find a doctor to work with.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. And we hope that people do well. We always want to see them doing better, and that's why we're here, is to maximize outcome in terms of both longer life as well as high quality of life. And it's not easy. Cancer is not an easy disease to tackle, but that's why we're here.
All right. Well, I think we'll leave it there. Jason, thank you so much for the time and the information. Thank you, everyone, for joining us and listening today. Once again, it's Sagely Health, sagelyhealth.com. And please reach out if we can be helpful. We're here for you.
Take care. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Jason.
All right. Bye-bye.